Going forward, probably the greatest challenge facing every organization, and especially our churches, is this sense that people have that they no longer feel connected. Now, this is in spite of the amazing tools that we have at our disposal. Everything from Zoom to social media, webinars, YouTube, etc. They don't help people necessarily. They're great tools, but they don't necessarily help people feel more connected. And that sense of disconnectedness will be, going forward, the greatest hindrance to both growth and sustainability. So let's look at how do we reconnect. That sense that people have where they feel less connected to our churches, to our organizations. I said that's probably the greatest challenge we face going forward. But more importantly, it's a hidden challenge that if we are not proactively addressing, what happens is by the time we realize they're an issue, it's almost always far too late to resolve it. So we need to be proactive. Now, I also said that all of these amazing tools we have, primarily electronic, while they're great, we have to be very careful and selective in how we use them to make sure they're effective, because frankly, over or inappropriate use actually exaggerates that feeling of disconnected, of feeling unimportant. So let's look at, I'm going to kind of talk you through what we've done in my past in business and how this relates in the church. How do we proactively rebuild, re-strengthen those connections? Especially when, now let me also say, this stuff, it all predates COVID. This is something that people have been sensing for a very long time. And frankly, the lockdown, coronavirus, only highlighted it. And so we want to take this opportunity to recognize it and strengthen our organizations. Now, we all know that going forward, as much as we'd love to believe that in the not too distant future, the doors are going to get thrown open and we're all going to be back together and everything will pick up where we left off. But the reality is very different. Through a combination of government guidelines and frankly, some people who just still don't feel comfortable, we're going to see it be less of an event and more of a process. And so as we prepare for that, we can make a plan that will help us grow stronger as people slowly assimilate back in and, more importantly, regain our momentum. So today we're going to look at several topics: high value versus low value communications, frequency, and then in the end we're actually going to look at vision and values and how that plays into that sense of feeling connected. So when I was still in business, one of the things my team, we were able to do, we learned over years, was how high value communication impacted that connection with someone versus what we're going to call low power. Now again, as we realize, rather than one big event, which would be exciting, we could do so much, that recognition that it's going to be a process of reassimilation, it really behooves us to focus on those high value communications to reinitiate that connection, even with relationships we might think are really, really strong. One of the things we have to do is kind of set aside our perception of those relationships and the recognition that we need to strengthen them across the board. So as we talk about high level versus low level, high power versus low power, let me give you some examples. Now, you will have to modify this based on how your church and organization functions, how much you can do in person, what tools people within the organization are comfortable with. So evaluate what we're talking about based on, predicated on what is most effective for you. But I'm going to give you just some examples. So a high power connection or communication is something that obviously we do face to face, especially one-on-one. Group events are great. There can be a sense of momentum and community. But when we're talking about rebuilding connections and strengthening connections, that is more powerfully done in a smaller group setting, in a one-on-one setting. But however, to a degree, we can't do that across the board, and it might be quite some time before we can. So if that is the ultimate, let's talk about the weakest. So, and then there's varying degrees in between. The weakest is a general, we'll call it a newsletter, whether it's an email blast, whatever that's just sent to everyone. That doesn't build connection in general. And all it does is says, oh, by the way, we're still here. So what happens is if we're not careful, we get caught in a rut of doing the same thing over and over without taking the time to back up and recognize, hang on, that's not necessarily a bad thing periodically, but are we using activity to replace productivity? And so again, group emails, newsletters, things like that, even group Zoom calls, if overused, can actually hinder that sense of connectedness. It can start to create a sensation that we're more concerned about doing the call, doing the newsletter, than we are about connecting with the people. So there's varying degrees. So one of the things we did in business, again, is we talked about the difference between high value and low value. In my mind, a group communication, in whatever format, is low value. Okay? Now, that doesn't mean it's not necessary, but when we're talking about building relationship, building connection, a group communication is in general almost always low value. One-on-one individually is the highest value. In between, there's varying degrees. To the best of our ability, let's use the tools that we have available to make those connections. If we can't do face-to-face, what's the next best thing? Is it a handwritten card? Handwritten, high value. It shows we're thinking of you personally rather than a generic card. A one-on-one Zoom call, a one-on-one phone call, a personal email, those things have varying degrees of value, but in general, they're going to be on the upper end of the scale as opposed to just group things, generic things. This is a time when more than ever, we need to take the time to connect with people individually. And you may say our organization is too big for that. Well, we're going to talk about a few things in a moment when we talk about frequency. But here's the other one that can be a trap. And this is what I call delegated communication. Delegated communication where, in a leadership structure, we may have leaders at the next level down who are communicating with those people weekly. Now, here's the thing. We have to be careful not to fall in a trap. Let's say that they're house group leaders, whatever it may be. We have to be careful that that layer of leadership who is communicating with those people on a regular basis, if we start to look at that as being all that's necessary, what we're going to find is more and more those people here don't feel connected to the actual leadership, to the vision, to the organization. Okay? So, yes, do we always have, to a degree, delegated communication or delegated relationships? Sure, because we can't manage everything ourselves. But everybody in the organization needs to hear, if you're at the very top, everybody in the organization needs to have some type of meaningful communication, some type of meaningful connection with you if you're the highest leader, the senior leader in the organization. That needs to happen on a periodic basis. And the trap we can fall into is delegating that. And because the repetition is happening more frequently, that next layer of leadership down that's communicating, we can look at that as being sufficient for the role without realizing, again, remember, this is a hidden challenge because by the time we realize those people there no longer feel connected, it's almost always too late to resolve the situation, to turn things around. So we're going to talk for a moment about frequency, okay? And again, going back, one of the comments I made is the recognition that this is a hidden challenge, that so often by the time we realize people don't feel like they have a meaningful connection to the group anymore, to the church, to the organization, it is almost always too late to resolve that situation, to turn things around. So we need to have a plan. Now, rather than just waiting for the opportunity, we should have a plan on how we're going to periodically have that meaningful connection. And it's okay to recognize that different people within the organization will have a different frequency. But let me share with you what we did. When I still had a business, my team had a commitment that we had a meaningful connection with every client at a minimum of quarterly. Now, you'll set the frequency for your organization based on what you think is appropriate. Maybe with other senior leaders, it's a lot more frequently. But here's my encouragement, my challenge to you. No matter how big the organization, and you're the senior leader, even those people that maybe are at a lower level, they need to have periodically a meaningful connection to you. If the only meaningful connection they're getting is through the other layers, as I call it, delegated communication, more and more they're going to feel disconnected from the leadership, the vision, and ultimately the entire organization. So it is entirely appropriate to have different timelines. But my challenge, my encouragement to you is to recognize everyone in the organization needs a periodic but meaningful connection to you. So again, going back to our business. So again, we had a commitment that every client had a meaningful connection at least quarterly. Now, that did not mean that necessarily I was the one always having that connection. And some people, based on the complexity of a project we were in, based on whatever needs they might have, they may have that meaningful connection on a much more frequent basis, and that's okay. But everybody needed that. And it was okay that periodically that might be, again, what I call a delegated communication, where someone else on the team had coffee with them, had a phone call with them. But we wanted to make sure, rather than just a generic email, that everybody on a regular basis had that connection, and that we would periodically look and say, hey, who on the team has not communicated with this person recently, so that they were getting a well-rounded viewpoint, a well-rounded relationship with, in our case, it was a business. But it should be the same thing with your organization, with your church, that people need that. And again, as I talked about, high value, low value, in an ideal world, the highest value were one-on-one, going and having a meal, having coffee, being able to sit down and talk about the challenges they're facing, the hopes and dreams. Even in business, that's the way we looked at it. But that's not always available or appropriate. So maybe it was a handwritten note, maybe it was a phone call, whatever it may be. Having a plan made sure that we didn't let anybody fall through the cracks. And we wanted to make sure that everybody associated with our company felt appreciated. How much more so should our churches feel this way? That everybody in the church should feel like I am valued and I'm appreciated. And just psychology is when the relationships they have are delegated because of, say, home group leaders or lay leaders, whatever the case may be, over time, there's less and less of a sense that they feel valued. So let's have that plan. Let's work on frequency, whatever it may be. But where we are making the effort, or we're making sure nobody's falling through the cracks, and we're having a meaningful connection with everybody in the organization on a periodic basis, recognizing some are more frequent than others. On a final note, I want to kind of just touch on a topic. When we're talking about meaningful connection, there has been a trend over the last number of years of leaders in churches and organizations, and it's all about vision. Now, here's the challenge with that. That sounds great, but here's the reality. Overuse, if we use vision as the purpose, as the content for that meaningful connection, it rapidly loses its value. And leaders can fall into the trap that believing if we just got them to understand the vision or to re-buy into the vision, then we've accomplished our goal and they'll be on board and we're all one big happy family moving forward together. But the reality is this: the more we focus on vision, the natural response is the less people feel connected to it. The more we focus on vision, the more it feels like something out there, but not for me. So rather than vision, we want to focus on people personally, but the one thing we absolutely, especially as we're coming out of a very unique season, we want to refocus on values. What are the values that are inherent, that are unique, that describe our church? What are the values that describe our organization? So where vision is nice and exciting, overuse actually becomes counterproductive. Discussing our values, actually, what we're doing is, see, our DNA determines who we are. Our DNA determines how we grow. Once a DNA is established, we don't have to do anything. It does the job for us. Refocusing on values while making that meaningful connection helps people reaffirm why this is an organization I need to be part of, why this church is something I need to be part of. And while we're re-emphasizing values rather than vision, we're reestablishing, we're strengthening that DNA, and that DNA literally will produce its own growth. So we need to recognize, not only has the world changed, but this loss of connection, it predates the coronavirus. All this has done is really highlighted the challenge. But this is the opportunity for us to, while we're searching out, seeing how God is instructing us to do things differently going forward, it also is helpful for us to recognize a refocus, a re-emphasis on our relationships will solve some of those hidden challenges. It will strengthen the organization and help rebuild our momentum.